education that is guided by values such as integrity, honesty, teamwork, and respect helps to solve most of the problems in the world, such as violence, pollution, inequality, corruption.
I think learning spaces are just as important as teachers and the material. They all have astronomical importance when it comes to education. You can have the best teachers in the world, the most detailed and clear textbooks, but it doesn't mean anything if the students don't feel safe.
A fulfilling learning experience for students is made up of many different facets, but it is a good teacher that is crucial to most. Having teachers who are dedicated to offering clarification on homework or encouraging small group study sessions are important.
Seeing assessments as the end goal undermines the process of education.
Society designed its education system in a way that ensures people follow the same path that has been followed by previous generation, believing it's the only path.
So like previous years, MGIP had organized the annual tech conference, which is Transforming Education for Humanity in December 2020. It was held virtually. But one of the highlights of that conference was a culmination of a dialogue that had happened over the past few months whilst the pandemics happened. And the primary objective really was just to bring in the primary stakeholders of education, and those are our young citizens and young students, into what they felt we should reimagine for education, okay, and what really are their voices saying if we are to reimagine education post the pandemic. And what emerged was a fascinating discussion amongst young people from different parts of the world. And to give you a few prominent takeaways from that discussion were that the values of education should really be guided by the values of society, and therefore society needs to be sure about what are the values they want to really promote as a humanity. And some of those values were integrity, honesty, and teamwork and respect. And how these are going to be necessary to address problems of violence, pollution, and inequality. And there were also ideas about how education extends much beyond just the school, and really the entire world becomes your learning space, as they call it. So you learn so much even outside the school, and so much through experience. Okay, so learning spaces become just as important as teachers and material, and we should really begin to ensure that we promote the values that we believe in as a society, not just in school and education, but also in the spaces we inhabit and cohabit together. And finally, a very important part of any discussion in education is on assessments. And a very important point that the students made was that assessments cannot be the end goal of education. Okay, they have to be a means to assess learning, and we must find ways to make sure that they assess learning. And so, really, ways for students to provide a guiding light towards what they may be going towards, rather than an exam being your deciding factor in what you're going to end up doing in life. And that is something that really shook us. That's not something that we want to end up children believing. And maybe that's been one of the big causes for stress and anxiety, which is on the increase. So following this, we got together 3 more experts who are passionate about the future of education, and discussed with them what are the primary takeaways and how might they discuss and imagine and elaborate on these points to be able to really fundamentally bring about a shift so that we can begin to find a way to imagine education which will move beyond the rhetoric. Gareth and Anne, it's been quite fascinating listening to these kids talk about how they want to reimagine education. And I'm very impressed by how they seem to have a lot of ideas very much in the right place, in the sense that they're talking about value systems that society needs to change about and think about, and how it's really society that begins to cue what the design of education systems should be. So education systems end up building the values that society begins to value, okay? And therefore it becomes important that we value the right things in people. So that's leading to a fundamental change in thinking about education and change in mindsets, in the sense that we're talking now of a bottom-up approach, that if society begins to change its value system, education will start working around trying to meet that value system. Is that something either of you have strong ideas about or different ideas about? I'd love to hear about from both of you. So maybe we'll start with Gareth.
Sure, I would actually disagree. That assertion is a very old assertion, and it's a very interesting one. It's one that a lot of people put a lot of thought into. John Dewey, for instance, argued this in like 1902, that fundamentally education was a project of taking an underdeveloped person and looking at sort of the social aims and values of society and trying to like fit those together in a way that makes sense. What education or what schools do is they tend to function to reproduce the social order that we already have. So it's like we have the social order, we have society, schools will reproduce, will create the people that are needed for that particular society. But I think that is problematic within our current social order. The school system that we have now was designed not to produce people for the world, but for the workforce. It was designed to select good workers for management, essentially. And that is not the only purpose of society. I think if we try to change society, then change education, or change education to change society, it won't work. I think it's an illogical proposition. I think fundamentally, if we want to transform education, we have to start with the individual. We have to start with the human person, and we have to personalize education. Several of the students spoke to this, and I think that they're really correct about that. And if we start with the human organism, we understand what a given human's individual needs are, like as step one, what are humans and what are their needs, and then work from there. And then secondly, individualize that for a given human, because we're massively different, we're beautifully diverse, we all have different needs. How would an educational process that's formalized in schools best serve a given individual? We need to be able to answer those questions and then work from there, I think.
Whilst it's very exciting to think about the fact that we might be able to think of education systems which are very personalized and could cater to individual needs, don't you think this could also get a little chaotic if needs vary too much? And that's where given the fact that we live in a societal structure, there needs to be some kind of common value system that we need to bring into place?
I think we might be able to think about it a little bit of an in-between approach. I do think that if we can focus on something that education has not always been very good at, and that is valuing what the individual students in the class are learning and bringing from other parts of their lives, not just valuing what's in the curriculum that they're learning or not learning, but recognizing and valuing and supporting the learning that they're doing at home and in their communities, the things that they're learning from their families and their friends and the society that they live in, things about how to communicate with one another, how to cooperate with one another, how to care for one another. If we can really redirect education to truly value those aspects, it's going to then kind of naturally make a difference in how we're teaching, and be able to individualize based on what the needs of the particular classroom are. Of course, we also need to be aware that children are potentially learning undesirable things. out in their world. They might live in traumatic situations. They might be experiencing, poverty and violence, and they might not have the benefit of truly caring people around them. And so again, we just need to be aware of what they're learning outside of school, find ways to support and value and build on that learning, or find ways to if need be, counter and provide, as one of the students said, the importance of a safe environment for them, and potentially, counter misinformation and prejudice and bias and some of the negative things that they might be learning. So to me, it seems that if we can ensure that what we're trying to accomplish through education, as Gareth said, try to back away from that. What we're trying to accomplish are checking off certain boxes of specific skills that are going to be and good for a certain kind of workforce or a production-oriented society. We focus more on who the students are, what their personal fulfillment is. And if that's the underlying goal for education, some of this I think can be more realistic in terms of reflecting those values of society, because the approach, the way we're connecting with children, will be from that personal fulfillment, that personal growth perspective, and rather than just thinking that, they need to learn how to do this very specific work-oriented task.
So thanks, Anne. I mean, listening to both Gareth and you, I think one thing that excites me tremendously when I'm listening to both of you is, because of the way that we understand how the human brain is structured, I actually think we have a very unique opportunity where we can try and get to what Gareth is talking about and what you are talking about too, and also try and make a difference in society. And here's the way I would want to pitch it. Okay, so one of the most reassuring things about the way the human brain is wired is we are naturally wired to be empathetic and to be kind and to be cooperative. Okay. So if we are in a position where we just follow those natural tendencies that we are born with, and we know this across humanity, this is not specific to you or Gareth or me, this is true across all human beings. And since we are born with these, what we really just need to do is to allow people to nurture these natural tendencies, and we will probably be beginning to gear or work towards a society that is naturally empathetic, kind, and cares for the environment, or all three of these together, rather than, and in that sense, this will cater to what Gareth talks about in terms of allowing each person to personally develop or to individually enhance that, rather than impose, which is what education tends to do these days, this is the value system you need to have. And so we actually are taking children away from a lot of their natural nurturing processes towards competitive processes, which ends up giving them more stress and develop different or probably not very sustainable value systems. So in some ways, probably because of our understanding of the way, not just the way human beings are wired, but the way we congregate as social beings is almost conducive towards creating an education system which allows each person to grow and nurture, but cooperate to be able to coexist. That's something that I think is an important part of being human, is to to not only begin to grow yourself, but to recognize that as you live with others, you have to be flexible enough to be able to accommodate all of that. And that's where you need to collaborate and cooperate. If each of us decides to do only what we want to do, that's not going to end up being a very sustainable system. Okay. But if we allow our natural tendencies to be nurtured, we might actually be able to arrive towards an organized system which is actually both sustainable, nurturing, and empathetic, yet allows us to be good versions of ourselves. Does that, and we have now the biology and the science to sort of support it. So I think, if anything, this is now a good time to begin to try and find ways to see how that might happen. Is that something that that either of you might be willing to buy into?
I actually, an interesting thought popped into my mind when we were talking, Nandini, because I completely agree with what you're talking about, but we're talking about it from the perspective of how the student is going to best learn. But if you apply the same description to education itself, to schooling itself, and think of it as an entity that could be supported in terms of being a cooperative entity, an empathic entity, that maybe that's a direction that will help us reimagine education for the better. Because I know that a lot of the really impressive innovations that I've read about have to do with schools and education systems that are partnering with places in their community, and that the schools themselves are have a deep connection with the community around them, and are working to do good, not just for the how they're teaching the students, but also to make their broader community a better place. And they bring community members in, and they support parents and families that need help, and they also have very close connections with civil society, with businesses, and so it becomes the school itself becomes a caring, communicative, cooperative entity as well. And then that provides an easier template then to be able to communicate those and support those same strengths in the students that they're working to teach.
Gareth, I'm wondering whether what Anne just talked about very nicely lends itself into already broadening the idea of a school actually going into what we might want to start calling learning spaces. Okay, so we begin to think of, we begin to broaden our ideas about education and learning as something that's not just happening in school, but in a learning space. And a learning space is might combine and consist of multiple structures, which is actually, ideally it's the world, because you're learning all the time. But if one had to include communities, environments, businesses, all of these become learning spaces. And so learning in education is actually happening all the time. Do you think this is something that we can begin to think about as we get into this discussion, and not just begin to think of learning as happening only in school?
The idea that we need to see learning as happening not only in the school, of course, it's absurd. Where do kids learn most? They learn most through play, and they learn through the internet, unfortunately. I think Anne made a really good point earlier about like the nature of like the learning environment that we have. We need to think that kids are literally learning all the time. Are they learning things that are worthwhile to be learned is the question. I think the best argument against personalization is that kids don't know what they don't know, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're just kids. So they don't yet know like all the horrible things out there, and a lot of things that are awful out there seem cool and they seem fun and they really kind of like engage their drives and desires in ways that are really damaging, I think. I don't think humans are solely empathetic and loving and caring. I think that we're all sorts of things. I think we're also really, really bad in lots of ways, but the question is why? And I think it's because we're damaged, we're traumatized. And we re-traumatize each other through schools, through parenting, through socialization. We don't know how to get along. I would argue that we can't really learn how to get along unless we have really excellent social emotional learning that is personalized. So let's take a given person as an example. I mean, we can have a community where we all know bullying's bad and it's important to be nice and all these things. And we can have these like norms in a classroom. But fundamentally, if I don't understand my own emotional self, my own conditioned reactivity, my own habits of engagement that are destructive as well as constructive, I don't know how to interrupt and change those. We need to fundamentally rethink and revolutionize education and schooling so that we actually do what matters, which is help humans flourish as their creative selves. But that'll never happen unless like we learn about ourselves in community with each other. So it's both, it's definitely both, but we really, really need to start, I would argue, and based on a lot of experience with every individual kid and helping them figure themselves out. It's a very, very, very difficult thing to do, but it can be done. And it's just a question of how to do it best and then scale.
So, I mean, whoever cracked that has cracked the $1 million question on how to do it and at scale. But I'm glad that you're gradually now beginning to move the discussion towards if we are to reimagine education systems and if we really want to think of a different future. Two clear ideas that seem to be emerging from the discussion are that education somehow has to become personalized, understanding the self, the emotional self, the social self, and the connected self, that is, working with the other, become crucial to making a fundamental change in not just education systems, but probably in the lives of human beings too, to coexist. Okay, and I think that's kind of bringing us to the idea of really what education is almost trying to do is to make sure that we learn to live with each other. That's what education seems to be about. I mean, the internet can now provide information, but learning to live with each other is what education seems to be all about.
In a loving way.
In a loving way.
We already live together.
Yes, in a loving way.
Together in a loving way.
Right.
And how can you voice your own ideas and concerns in a productive way while at the same time being very respectful of others and what they might have to contribute, and find that point of negotiation and that point of consensus, and to do it without re-traumatizing ourselves, as Gareth said, because that's unfortunately a potential when you're trying to bring people with different ideas together, and the potential is very strong, and I see it every day in the news in terms of one side and the other side and the us and them mentality. So how do we? But it's very important that people do have, and young people especially, do have that opportunity to share their voice, to share their ideas and their thoughts, and to figure out what that even is. To have the freedom and the safety to be able to explore what it is that they think and feel, and gain the additional information and knowledge that helps them develop that, without it just falling into a rut of this is what I should think. So to have that independence of thought, but at the same time be able to, as Gareth said, lovingly and respectfully be able to work with someone who might be going down a different thought path, and ideally bring it together into something that's going to function for society and for their community, and be able to bring something productive and valuable out of it all.
Yeah, I think it's about valuing diversity. Like, the fundamental ordering principle of nature is diversity. We wouldn't have evolved to the state that we've evolved to if we didn't have such a diverse planet. We don't value the diversity amongst humans, though. And it's disrespectful to Mother Nature, and it's disrespectful to ourselves, and it's really a problem. We need to stop doing this. But it's not necessarily easy. So, like, we're conformist by nature because it helps us get along socially, but our conformism is also a barrier to our personal growth. Mm-hmm. And especially for young kids, like, they go through phases of, like, in like grades 4, 5, and 6, and well, forever really, of getting like super conformist minded and focused on like popularity and being cool, and they become really mean. Mm. And that has to be like worked out of like the collective sort of like learning community. It's really, really difficult and problematic because we have all these like conditioned reactions. Then we have the internet saying these people are idiots or these people are uncool. And then we align with people whose voices reinforce our own beliefs so that we feel safer and more comfortable. Then we become stronger in our belief that we're right and they're wrong. And this is really, really bad. We need to see the beauty in everyone. We should be able to create social spaces that, as one of those kids said, are safe, psychologically safe, socially safe, so that everybody can be their full selves instead of hiding all the time. The kids are hiding because they're afraid to be themselves, because they're afraid of being judged, and it hurts to be judged. We need to work on these kinds of skills, like first and foremost and fundamentally in the early years, in order to really activate our potential. If we don't do this, what we get is what we have. And what we have isn't good enough. We need to change. We can.
So that brings us to another very interesting point, which, as I heard both Anne and you speak, is a fundamental change. And therefore, education and learning needs to do is empower kids or empower humans to be themselves. That's it. I mean, it's probably as simple as that. I don't have to be like anybody. I just have to be myself and be okay with it. That's it.
So hard.
It's something as simple as that, but extremely difficult to do, because
one of the hardest things on earth.
So imagine we're thinking of school days where you will spend a significant time discovering yourself, a significant time being in the environment. That sounds like such a fun school day. Mm-hmm. I mean, I would love to. I would love to, and being in an extended community, not being in four walls, but talking of the new learning spaces that we were thinking about, and I think given the fact that we live in a day and age where it's impossible to sort of close on a discussion on education without talking about assessments, which is kind of a little sad because it's been overemphasized. But I thought one of the kids did a great job of saying that rather than assessments being an end goal, they need to become a tool to make sure what kind of learning is happening and whether there are some changes that need to be made. And it made so much sense to me. I'm like, that's true. It's being treated as an end goal, and that's absolutely the wrong thing to do. And I'm wondering how both of you might want to talk to the notion of assessments.
Don't conflate grading and assessment. The purpose of assessment is not to measure learning; it's to drive learning. So fundamentally, assessment is about figuring out what can you do relative to what it is that you want to do, or the teachers are saying that you need to do. Where are you? And then being able to ascertain that well, and then giving excellent feedback information that's specific and actionable so that kids are able to drive their learning forward, reflect, and then continue the process until they've reached their goals. If that's how assessment is used, then it's used very, very well. That's how coaches use assessment, right? Like a baseball player gets better at batting, not by, I don't know, looking at his batting percentage and getting mad at him and comparing it to the other person's batting percentage and saying, oh, that manager has better like players. You need to look at where an individual is at and what they want to do and then help them get there. And that can only work in a personalized way. It can happen very well collaboratively. There's lots of excellent digital tools to be able to help kids do collaborative peer assessment. Really, really, really powerful. Kids can often learn best from each other in terms of feedback information because they're closer to the problem. So like there's a knowledge problem that teachers often have. Professors have this the worst. Like they're so knowledgeable in their area that they don't really know how to explain it well, because it's just so obvious to them. Whereas somebody who's new to learning a complex concept or skill has much more closeness to the problem of learning with which to be able to explain to another person what it is that they need to do. Whereas like often like the experts themselves don't actually know how to explain things well. We need to be able to galvanize the power of kids' intelligence vis-a-vis each other so that they can help each other learn. And that isn't going to happen automatically. It happens when it's facilitated well by excellent teachers. But a lot of teachers already do that. This is something that's been in the works for a very, very long time. Dylan William is probably the biggest expert in the world on this, and very worth listening to. I think that this is one of the easier things to change. The problem fundamentally is that universities want grades. They don't want growth. They don't want grown humans. They don't want mature beings. They want whatever they want. They want to select for their purposes, which are, I would say, counterproductive to the development of a human individual and community.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the key in terms of making a difference with assessment, is kind of going back to the very beginning of our conversation and talking about what is it that we want education to be doing. Because if we really make a difference there, then that's going to necessitate a change in what we're assessing for. You know, are we assessing for what those universities want in terms of grades, or are we assessing for, have we made a difference in these young people's lives in terms of their personal fulfillment and growth? And, I would like to see it be something that makes a difference on the social and emotional side of things. Are our assessments really evaluating, how the students themselves are feeling about their education? Are we using assessment as an opportunity to let students tell us where things just aren't working for them? And so then that, that if they're feeling that they're not, their voice is not being heard, if they're not getting an opportunity to make a difference, if they're just feeling that they're having to check off boxes to get to the next stage, if the assessment can tap into that, then we can start exploring ways that we can reach them better. But if we don't pay attention to that, we're not gonna know. So like I said, it kind of goes back to what are we trying to accomplish before we can really think about how we assess it.
So I think that, as you said, coming back to where we started out, and given that we started out talking a lot about personalized learning education, I'm even looking at whether we can begin to change the word assessment to look at personal growth. Therefore, begins to put in an idea: is growth always for the better, or can there be a different nuance towards growth too? Okay, or do we want to continue to call these as assessments only? So I'm trying to see whether we can sort of end this conversation by maybe putting out one or two other ideas in terms of what an assessment should look like or might be referred to in the context of personalized learning, education, and development. Any other terms that might come your way that you think we can begin to put out for people to begin to think about? Or should we just continue to stay with the word assess? Somehow, assess seems to have a very college-like grade quality to it. So I'm just leaving this out as a last shot in the dark at whether there's something we can end this conversation on there in terms of new terms to look at. I'm not really saying measuring learning, but to make sure learning's happening.
I'm not sure the word assess is that big of a problem. It's what we assess. It's whether and how we assess. It's as Anne said, like, what are the purposes that we, and what are the things that we care about to assess? And then are we assessing for growth or for outcomes? And I think we should assess for growth. And if we do that, then the word assessment will have significantly less of a negative connotation and felt sort of like response. One of the things I'd really like people to ponder is the question of, like, how would we seriously assess social and emotional learning growth in an individual? Like, what would that actually look like? Like, how would we be able to identify and be able to support and, say, measure and then help sort of like nudge an individual in understanding their own feelings and being honest with themselves and being able to understand and face their own pain and try to heal? I mean, it's such a complicated question, right? So it would, like, a given person's, like, sort of, to get into like a flourishing, self-actualizing social emotional state is going to be a very, very different journey for every person.
Absolutely.
And so I wonder, like, how we might help kids understand what, like, a well human looks like, and what, like, the social emotional components of that human are, and how a given individual and incredibly diverse sets of individuals might get to not like a perfect human, but like kind of like an ideally well, but maybe weird human, but still healthy in terms of like a good self-concept, good self-esteem, self-knowledge, understanding, the ability to cooperate, communicate clearly, to deal with social conflict, to be able to resolve in a restorative way problems that come up. Like, what would it take to actually be able to identify those outcomes and assess them? I think it's a really, really, really big project, and I think it should be a global project.
Sure, absolutely. And your last thoughts about this?
Well, to go back to your question about words and terminology, I think we're all coming back to the word growth in one way or another, and progress maybe, although that can be kind of tied in a little too much. I do like Gareth's analogy of a baseball coach, because some of the best coaches, whether they are athletic, music, education, they're focusing on how you have improved personally. It's not about whether you're the fastest runner on the cross country team. It's did you go faster and have more stamina and feel better physically at the end than you did yourself last month. So to be able to think about assessment as personal growth rather than comparative progress is, I think, key.
So very interestingly, therefore, we're coming back to complete Gareth's initial model is we can begin to talk about personal growth, and we can set our own I wouldn't say benchmarks, but decide how we are growing, and maybe that's something that universities can start looking out for. How much of what you aspire to you've grown towards. Okay, and if you've been able to show you've been able to grow, you're on the right path, and that therefore some learning has certainly happened. And ultimately, I think. The success of education and learning is how happy you can be every morning when you wake up and look forward to the day ahead. it's just as exciting to wake up every morning and say, I'm looking forward to the day ahead. And I think it's ultimately just boils down to that. So that's
like that.
my personal notion of it. But I think it's at least keeps me grounded and keeps it simple so that I can actually discuss that, whether it's somebody who's sweeping the streets or it's a world-class musician. They all understand that language. And I think that's the power of any educational learning, to be able to communicate with anybody and everybody, and lovingly and kindly.
Absolutely.
So that's
beautiful.
That's really what we're all about. So it's been wonderful chatting with you, and I've enjoyed this conversation and could probably go on for another 12 hours, as Gareth says, but I recognize we have days and evenings ahead of us. Thank you so much